highest heart love. Thank you for being here for this book reading. We are now in the middle of chapter 4 of Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare. I'm your moderator and narrator, Uriel NEVEU. So we pick up at page 70. It's going to be good. So listen, this is Puerto Ricans. This is good. Puerto Ricans. Puerto Rico was occupied by the United States in 1898 during the Spanish-American War and was ceded to this country as part of the treaty with Spain. Though our stated intention had been to provide revenues and civil government only on a temporary basis, annexation was soon followed by American investment, which revolutionized the production of sugar and changed the nature of farming on the island. Peace, highest heart love. Thank you guys for being here. Much love. In 1917, the Organic Act, sometimes called the Jones Act, admitted all Puerto Ricans to American citizenship, except those who petitioned to retain their formal political status. Puerto Rico itself was recognized as an organized but unincorporated territory. Jurisdiction over the territory was in the hands of the War Department until 1934, when it was transferred to the Interior Department. But it was not until 1947 that the Puerto Ricans could elect their own governor. In 1950, Congress passed legislation allowing Puerto Rico to become Commonwealth, and in 1952, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico was established. This meant that Puerto Rico was a self-governing political unit, voluntarily associated with the United States, whose inhabitants were American citizens. United States annexation changed the economic organization of the island, while the introduction of American medical techniques and sanitary improvements lowered the death rate. The result was a rapid growth in population, which was not matched by an increase of jobs. The population of 953,243 in 1899 had grown to 2,210,703 by 1950. In spite of large-scale migration to the United States, the island's current population density of more than 700 people per square mile makes it one of the most densely populated areas of the world. From 1901 to 1960, Puerto Rico's death rate dropped from 36.7 per 1,000 to a subnormal 6.7. A rate, however, declined at a much slower rate from 43.2 in 1947 to 31.5 in 1960. Though vast strides were made in economic progress, particularly in the last few decades, which saw the annual per capita income of $120 in 1940 rise to $740 in 1963. The median income is still far below that of any American state. Inevitably, large numbers of islanders migrated to the United States for work. During the 1950s, some 50,000 people a year left the island, a rate which has somewhat declined in recent years, in part because many older people are now returning. There is still, nonetheless, a consistent outpouring of residents into the United States. Before 1920, there were only an estimated 15,000 Puerto Ricans residing in the United States. Once the Puerto Ricans were given citizenship, however, their status changed from immigrant to migrant, and the numbers rapidly increased. In the decade 1921 through 1930, some 52,774 settled on the mainland. 1931 through 1940, 69,967. 1941 through 1950, 226,110. And 1951 through 1960, 615,384. It is estimated that there are now more than 1 million Puerto Ricans living in the United States, some 600,000 of them in New York City. Unlike earlier settlers, the Puerto Ricans came by air, and the comparative ease with which they can migrate has encouraged them to consider themselves only as temporary residents. Like the Mexican Americans of the Southwest, there is also considerable two-way traffic between the island and the mainland. Puerto Ricans are of mixed racial origins. The original Spanish conquest was so devastating that the Indian population was virtually wiped out. Most of the present inhabitants are descendants of the Spanish and their Negro slaves, with only a slight Indian mixture. In the 1960 census return, approximately 20% of the island population was classified as non white. There is, however, a wide variation in skin color among the population. Based upon skin color, there is an informal prejudice against the darker members mhm, of society, particularly if their socioeconomic status is also low. Nonetheless, in New York City and other urban centers to which they have migrated, this comparative lack of prejudice and identity related to skin color has created considerable controversy between Puerto Ricans and Negroes. Negroes expected the dark Puerto Ricans to give support to the civil rights and Black Power movements, but in the past, these people have been much more likely to identify with their light skinned cousins from Puerto Rico than the American Negroes. Since Puerto Ricans, in spite of intense efforts, still have low educational levels in Puerto Rico and are the newest migrants in the eastern cities, they also tend to be the poorest. They have inherited the most deteriorated slum areas, many moving into formerly black areas, which the upwardly mobile Negroes were happy to leave behind. The newly arrived workers also tend to find jobs as laborers or machine operators, which in New York usually means they work in the garment industry. Although there are as yet few second generation Puerto Ricans resident on the continent, some intergenerational upward mobility has been noted. A 1960 comparison of first and second generation migrants indicated that while only 15% of the first generation workers held white collar jobs, 31% of the second generational workers were in white collar occupations. In spite of this statistical progress, however, the overwhelming majority of Puerto Ricans in this country hold very low-level jobs and are susceptible to being laid off as soon as the rate of unemployment rises. Here we go. That's Puerto Ricans. Peace, highs, heart, love, guys. We are reading from Poverty, Ethnic Identity, Ethnic Identity and Healthcare. We are on the bottom of page 72. All right. So here we are at Cubans. All right. Peace, guys. Thank you so much. Greetings, greetings. Thank you so much. Cuba was long closely tied economically to the United States, and in the past, some analysts spoke of it as being essentially an economic dependency of the United States. The United States had originally become involved in the war with Spain, largely as a result of Cuba's efforts to free itself. And though we recognize the independence of Cuba, we were ceded a large naval base, Guantanamo Bay, in Cuba itself. The United States has also reserved the right to intervene militarily in Cuba whenever it felt Cuban independence was threatened. American investment soon dominated Cuba, which in turn led to a considerable movement of Cubans to the United States. Even before the Spanish American War, the cigar industry in Key West and Tampa had been founded by Cuban refugees. By 1960, the population of the Cuban stock in the United States totaled 124,416 persons, of whom 116,354 were classified as white and 8,062 non-white. It is interesting to note that although Negroes comprise an estimated 25% of the Cuban population, only about 6.5% of the Cubans coming to the United States before the Castro takeover were classed as Negroes. Most of the early Cuban immigrants settled in Florida and New York, although New Jersey, Illinois, and California also had large numbers of Cubans. The nature of this Cuban immigration changed radically when Fidel Castro overthrew the dictatorship of Fulgen- Fulgencio Batista at the beginning of 1959. Many of Batista's followers fled to the United States, and soon afterwards, Castro launched an intensive propaganda campaign blaming many of the ills of his country on the Americans. By the end of 1960, in retaliation for the United States' elimination of the Cuban sugar import quota, Castro nationalized United States investments in Cuba, which amounted to more than $1 billion. The United States broke diplomatic relations with Cuba at the beginning of 1961, and relations between the two countries have not been much improved since. An increasing number of Cubans sought refuge in the United States as Castro tightened his control on the country and adopted a program of encouraging those who did not agree with him to leave. There were regularly scheduled air flights from Cuba to Miami from the end of 1959 to October 1962, when they were discontinued during the missile crisis. A second large-scale exodus of Cubans began late in 1965 when the United States and Cuba agreed to allow special flights from Havana to Miami. As self-imposed political exiles, the Cubans were admitted under special refugee quotas. Most of them probably never intended to settle in the United States permanently, but rather to go back to Cuba as soon as Castro was overthrown. For a time, in fact, many of them were deeply involved in revolutionary activities designed to overthrow Castro. With the passage of time, however, more and more of them have begun to settle down and begin the process of becoming American citizens. In the first great exodus from Cuba between 1959 and 1962, it is estimated that nearly a quarter of a million refugees arrived in the United States, with a high point of 3,000 a week at Miami Airport just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. The second wave of refugees has been nearly as large. Since most of the refugees were forced to leave money and possessions behind them as a condition for exit from Cuba, they often arrived only with the clothes on their back. In spite of this, the Cubans differed from most other past migrants to these shores, and particularly from the Mexican Americans and the Puerto Ricans in both their educational levels and their sophistication. Though there are refugees from all classes of pre Castro Cuban society, from illiterate peasants to millionaires, a disproportionate number came from the middle and upper strata of society. The overwhelming majority of them, in fact, can be classified as professional, semi professional, managerial, white collar, or as skilled workers. This means that once the trauma of relocation was over, the vast majority of them were able to earn adequate or over even high level incomes and did not suffer from the long term poverty related health problems. Undoubtedly, however, the loss in status was extremely painful, and the problems of adjusting to another language meant added burdens. But most of the Cubans adjusted fairly rapidly. Many of the professionals had to undergo new training or gain additional experience to qualify for American licensure. And some, such as lawyers, had to find a new occupation because Cuban law has little in common with America. The greatest health problems occurred in Florida as the refugees first landed. Control of epidemics is always a problem when large numbers of people are moved into temporary and crowded quarters, and this problem was complicated by the communication barriers. Eventually, Cuban nurses were hired as aides by the Miami Health Department until they qualified for more American licensure, and they proved remarkably effective in bridging the health information gap. Perhaps the most pressing problem were the more than 13,000 unaccompanied children who were sent by frightened parents who were not at all sure that they themselves would ever be able to join them. Hmm. Most of these parents eventually did leave Cuba and reestablished their families, but for a time, the placement of the children and the problem of helping them to adjust to the loneliness and new surroundings was an overwhelming task for the workers in Miami. It should be added that the federal government itself assumed a greater burden for these immigrants to American shores than for any other group. And in fact, up to 1967, the government had spent more than $200 million in assisting Cubans to retain and relocate, an average of about 1,000 per adult Cuban. All right. We're in the middle of page 75, guys. Thank you so much, Miss Nobody. Thank you so much. Highest heart love. You guys rock. Thank you for reading with us. Health problems of Mexican Americans. Since Mexican Americans are lumped together with other whites in official records, Comparisons of their mortality and morbidity rates with those of other groups are difficult. It is not, however, impossible. There have been some studies of mortality rates which use the Spanish surname as a category, and these studies suggest that Mexican Americans share the poverty related health problems that are the main cause of poor health among Negroes. A study of majority rates conducted in Colorado indicated that the people with Spanish surnames were much more likely to die of rheumatic fever, pneumonia, and influenza than were members of the Anglo population. Since the timely administration of antibiotics for streptococcus, streptococca infections can prevent rheumatic fever from ever developing, while the mortality rate for pneumonia and influenza can be lessened by early treatment. It seems obvious that these death rates are clearly related to a lack of adequate medical care. The Colorado study also found that neonatal deaths were 3 times as high among the Spanish surname group as among Anglos, reflecting not only less adequate conditions at and following delivery, but also a lack of prenatal care, as well as poor general nutrition and health of the mother. Fatal accidents were also a major cause of death among members of the Spanish surname population, and although lack of medical care may again be implicated here, the Colorado commissions which sponsored the study believed that use of the old automobiles and unsafe equipment was the most important factor in explaining this finding. The city of San Antonio annually publishes statistics which allow comparisons to be made among the Mexican Americans, white and non white populations. In general, these tabulations support the findings of the Colorado study. Respiratory diseases were a major cause of death, and infant mortality rates are high. In addition, in San Antonio, there are a noticeably high fatality rate from diabetes among both the non white and Mexican American populations. Although the fatality rate is again partially due to a lack of medical care, there is not the whole cause of the differential rate because other studies have shown that the diabetes morbidity rate is also higher among these two ethnic groups than in among the population in general. More complete explanations for these differences await basic research into genetic factors as well as effects of the high starch diet, which so often accompanies poverty. Mm, that's like rices and grains like that. That's where the starches are. It is interesting to note that Mexican Americans are much less likely to die of neoplasms, vascular diseases, and heart diseases than other Americans. These diseases, commonly associated with aging, are much less common among all poverty populations, undoubtedly because of their earlier age of death from other causes. There is, however, some indication that the lifestyles associated with affluence may help cause heart and vascular diseases, and affluence is not yet a problem for the Mexican Americans as a group. In talking to the residents of the barrios, one gathers that discrimination in obtaining health care is not so important to them as it is to the Negroes, perhaps because discrimination is overshadowed by the problems associated with the language barrier and other aspects of cultural barriers separating Mexican Americans from Anglos. The monolingual Spanish speaking patients finds a visit to an English speaking physician or an American hospital frightening and often not particularly fruitful. Unless he takes a bilingual friend with him as an interpreter, the exchange of information is apt to being meager because few health professionals in the Southwest are Spanish speaking. The East Los Angeles Health Task Force, a community based organization which has temporary funding from the Office of Economic Opportunity, gathered information about the experiences of Barrios residents when they confronted the Anglo healthcare system. They reported that a frightened old man watched a young Anglo physician give him penicillin in spite of the fact that he and his excited family were sure he was allergic to the drug, and tried to tell this to the doctor who did not understand them. There are numerous stories of patients who were taken to surgery who did not know they were going to be operated on, as well as tales about people who were merely being transferred from one ward or area to another and thought they were going to surgery. Mm. After considerable agitation, the Health Task Force was able to convince Los Angeles County Hospital that more Spanish speaking nurses, aides, and attendants should be hired so that the interpreters would be available not only to assist with taking the patient's history, but also to explain hospital procedures to the patients. Puerto Rican health. This is so apt, guys. Hi, it's Heart Love. We are doing it. Thank you for reading. We're well into chapter 4, and we're just about to let go this section. So I'm going to go through Puerto Rican health right here. All right. We'll put a pin. Puerto Ricans are as concentrated on the eastern seaboard as Mexican Americans are in the Southwest. The climate of New York City, however, is radically different from that of Puerto Rico, so that these people must adjust to a more radical change in living conditions than the Mexican Americans in the Southwest. Population is also much more concentrated in the eastern part of the United States than in the western, so that overcrowding and unsanitary conditions lead to additional health problems. Since they are new migrants, the Puerto Ricans tend to settle in the most depressed housing areas where their residents are often heavily infested with rats. The New York City Department of Health between 1947 and 1953 reported an average of 500 cases of rat bites each year, an extremely high percentage of them among Puerto Rican families. Tuberculosis was long endemic in Puerto Rico, and until fairly recently, Puerto Rico had a higher death rate from tuberculosis than any country that gathers statistics. This susceptibility to tuberculosis is often increased by poor, overcrowded housing conditions in the United States, as well as by deficient knowledge about healthcare and sanitation practices. Between 1949 and 1951, there were 474 reported cases of tuberculosis per 100,000 Puerto Rican residents. Earlier in the 1930s, Puerto Ricans living in New York had a higher mortality rate from tuberculosis than did the Puerto Ricans who remained on the island. In 1958, a study of some 80 Puerto Rican families living in New York City, 9 patients and 6 of the families were undergoing treatments for tuberculosis. Puerto Ricans also suffer from a variety of parasitic diseases, including dysentery, malaria, filariasis, caused by a small worm, which lives in the lymphatics of the body and is spread by the mosquito. Schistosomiasis, schistomiasis, and manosoni depended upon uh, a snail carrier, which attacks the liver, and hookworm, also found in the American South. The New York City Health Department has stated that generally poor health conditions of large numbers of Puerto Ricans was largely due to the presence of these parasites. Oh man, we're getting into it. This is deep. We are doing it. Influencing the general health of the Puerto Rican migrants is widespread malnutrition. The chief articles of food on the island for the poor people are rice and beans, arroz and gandules, with the beans serving as the main source of protein. Puerto Ricans eat few green or leafy vegetables, and only rarely do they use milk and eggs. Bread is also not generally used in all parts of the island. To this basic starch diet, the Puerto Rican adds cheap fats, usually lard or olive oil, in liberal quantities. Consequently, internal disorders are widespread. When the Puerto Rican is transplanted to New York, the deficiency in his diet is made even worse by the relative lack of sunshine. Vitamin D. That's why I always am telling you guys, go take a walk, Man, get that sunlight. It's so important. So important. The effect of migration upon health was demonstrated in New York City study, which found that 20% of a sample of 216 migrants were hospitalized within the first year after leaving Puerto Rico. In the years following the first one, there tended to be a decline in hospitalizations. The reason for this are not entirely clear. It might be that those suffering from chronic diseases prior to migration are apt to seek treatment soon after arrival. In fact, a few of them seem to have been sent north by their doctors or their families for treatment of specific illness. The trauma of moving itself might also tend to aggravate long-standing illnesses. Separation from home and family can cause a painful adjustment as well as some practical difficulties. Since the family pattern in both Mexico and Puerto Rico tends to be extended, the individual can call on and expect help from many relatives in times of illness or other crises. Inevitably, moving to the United States breaks up some of these units, and although people may eventually reestablish the extended family pattern by helping relatives to move or by seeking out relatives who are already here, this often takes time, so that new migrants are forced to turn to clinics or hospitals for care, which would have been available from relatives in their old environment. The stress of moving is also further complicated by other family problems. Consensual unions are common in Puerto Rico, but many of these unions are fairly stable, so that they are, for most practical purposes, similar to the more formal union of marriage. However, under the impact of urbanization and migration, the informal arrangements tend to break down, and the single man and woman are left alone to cope with the new environment, or women are left as heads of households. For a woman who has grown up expecting help from all of her female relatives as well as support from her husband, such a desertion can be overwhelming. For a man who has always been surrounded by relatives, the newfound freedom may spell loneliness. And we'll pause right here, guys. right in the center of page 79, Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare by Vern Bullough and Bonnie Bullough. I thank you all for being here and reading this section. And highest heart love to all of you. Much love. If you were to see right now, right next to me, thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Miss Black Fox. Highest heart love and honor. I want to say and wish all of you a wonderful, wonderful, and happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. You know, we have to celebrate ourselves, celebrate our families, you know. So, for instance, today I am 16,555 days and nights on this planet. That's how it goes, right? Mastering the self. So, I want y'all to have a wonderful time. Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy your family and friends. We are doing it. Happy Kwanzaa. Peace, peace. Yes. Oh, look right next to me. You want to see? All right, I'll show you. So cute, right? She loves to listen to me read, I guess. I love y'all. Yes. That's right. That's right. Thank you so much. I know, right? She's chilling. Well, yeah. Thank you guys for all joining us. So much honor and love. Yeah, peace. That's right. You know, that's what I learned, man. I've done so many amazing things. And when we start really tapping into our self peace, self love, you'll see everything else around you starts to take on that energy. I call it a spiritual osmosis. So, thank you guys for reading Poverty, Ethnic Identity, and Healthcare. We get to see some of these correlations, right? How it, is panning out. I want y'all to have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful evening. Rest well. Highest heart love. Peace. Oh, thank you, Xander. Oh man, peace, peace, Xander. Highest heart love. Thank you guys for all y'all love. Thank you so much. If y'all do want to, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Thank you. Peace. All right.